David Henderson stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror one morning, carefully adjusting his blue silk tie. At 45, he still maintained his appearance well, salt and pepper hair neatly trimmed, workout sessions 3 times a week keeping his body fit. But lately, the eyes looking back at him seemed tired, almost vacant. The sound of his wife Linda's voice drifted up from the kitchen below, probably reminding their teenagers about some after-school activity. He could picture her there, efficiently managing their household as she had done for the past 20 years. Linda was still beautiful, still kind, still exactly the same person he'd fallen in love with in college. Maybe that was part of the problem. Their life together was picture perfect on paper. The sprawling 2-story house in an upscale neighborhood, 2 cars in the garage, family vacations twice a year. Their kids, 16-year-old Michael and 14-year-old Grace, were both honor students. David's construction company was thriving, having just landed several major contracts. They had everything they'd ever dreamed of when they were young and just starting out. Yet somehow, over the years, life had become predictable. Every morning, the same routine. Every evening, the same conversations over dinner about school, work, and neighborhood gossip. Every weekend, the same social events with the same group of friends they'd known for decades. Even their occasional arguments followed familiar patterns, like actors reciting well-worn lines in a play they'd performed too many times. David walked downstairs, accepting the travel mug of coffee Linda handed him with a distracted smile. She was talking about the upcoming school fundraiser she was organizing, but his mind wandered. When had their relationship become more about scheduling and logistics than passion and connection? When had they stopped really seeing each other and started just going through the motions? "Dad, can you drive me to basketball practice after school?" Michael asked, looking up from his phone. "Mom has a committee meeting." "Sorry, buddy. I've got that big client presentation today, remember? It might run late." David felt a twinge of guilt at his son's poorly hidden disappointment. He'd been missing more and more of these moments lately, buried in work that somehow never seemed to mend. Grace barely looked up from her breakfast, absorbed in some drama with her friends that had seemed earth-shattering the night before. David remembered when his little girl used to run to hug him every time he walked into a room. Now, she barely acknowledged his presence unless she needed money or a ride somewhere. The morning routine played out like clockwork. Linda reminding the kids about homework and appointments, quick goodbye kisses, everyone rushing off in different directions. David sat in traffic on his way to the office, his mind drifting to the upcoming presentation. His company was bidding on a major downtown development project that could take them to the next level. The office was already buzzing when he arrived. His assistant handed him a stack of messages and updated him on some minor crisis with a supplier. Walking to his corner office, David nodded at familiar faces, people he'd worked with for years, their relationships as comfortable and predictable as everything else in his life. He spent the morning reviewing figures and rehearsing his presentation. The client meeting wasn't until afternoon, but he wanted everything to be perfect. This project could mean expanding the business into new territory, taking on bigger challenges. At least work still offered some excitement, some sense of forward momentum. During lunch, David scrolled through social media on his phone. An old college friend had just posted pictures from an adventure trip to South America. Another acquaintance was celebrating his recent divorce by moving to Thailand to start a beach bar. David felt an unexpected pang of envy. When had he become so settled? He thought back to his younger self, the ambitious dreamer who was going to build an empire, travel the world, live life on his own terms. Somewhere along the way, that young man had transformed into someone else, responsible, reliable David Henderson, pillar of the community, living the suburban dream. The afternoon client meeting went well. The potential clients seemed impressed by the presentation, asked all the right questions. David was in his element here, confident and charismatic. One of the client representatives even joked that they should continue the discussion over drinks, but David declined. Linda was making his favorite lasagna tonight, and he'd already missed 2 family dinners this week. Driving home through the familiar streets of their neighborhood, David felt that nagging restlessness again. The perfectly manicured lawns, the identical SUVs in every driveway, the scheduled monotony of it all, when had this become his life? He loved his family deeply, appreciated everything he and Linda had built together. But lately he couldn't shake the feeling that there should be more. He pulled into his driveway just as the sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Through the kitchen window, he could see Linda moving around, probably putting final touches on dinner. 20 years ago, that sight would have filled him with warmth and contentment. Now it just reminded him of all the days that had come before and all the identical days stretching ahead. Michael was sprawled on the couch watching basketball highlights. The practice he'd missed had apparently gone well without him. Grace was texting rapidly on her phone, barely looking up when he walked in. Linda greeted him with a quick kiss and asked about his day, but was clearly distracted by dinner preparations. The presentation went great, David said, though no one seemed particularly interested. This could be a real game changer for the company. That's wonderful, honey, Linda replied automatically, setting plates on the table. Michael, please put your phone away during dinner. Grace, did you finish that history project? David sat at his usual place at the head of the table, looking at his family's familiar faces. He loved them, that had never changed and never would. But as he mechanically answered questions about his day and listened to the kids' school stories, that hollowed feeling in his chest grew stronger. Later that night, lying awake beside Linda's sleeping form, David stared at the ceiling and wondered, was this all there was? Had he somehow missed a turning point, taken a wrong path somewhere along the way? He thought about his college friends' South American adventures, the Thailand beach bar dream. Not that he wanted those specific things, but he longed for something. Something to shake up this comfortable numbness that had settled over his life like a thick blanket. Little did David know, life was about to give him exactly what he thought he wanted, though not in any way he could have anticipated. The comfortable predictability he'd been taking for granted was about to be shattered, and the consequences would reach far beyond anything he could imagine on this quiet, ordinary night. The morning the new marketing director walked into David's office, something shifted in his carefully ordered world. Rachel Chen was 28, with an energy that seemed to light up every room she entered. She'd come highly recommended, with an impressive track record of modernizing traditional companies' marketing strategies. David had hired her specifically to help take his construction company into the digital age. Mr. Henderson, she'd said, shaking his hand with confidence. I can't wait to show you my ideas for revolutionizing your brand presence. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and David found himself leaning forward in his chair, genuinely interested in what she had to say. Over the next few weeks, David found more and more reasons to stop by the marketing department. Rachel's fresh perspective wasn't just good for business, it was awakening something in him that he thought had long gone dormant. She saw possibilities where he saw obstacles, approached problems with a creativity that made him question his own conventional thinking. Their first late-night working session happened naturally. A major proposal was due, and Rachel had suggested some last-minute changes that could give them an edge. Just hear me out, she'd said, spreading printouts across his desk. What if we approached this from a completely different angle? Hours flew by as they bounced ideas back and forth. David couldn't remember the last time he felt so energized, so mentally stimulated. When they finally wrapped up around 9, he realized he'd missed 3 calls from Linda. Sorry, got caught up in work, he texted quickly. It wasn't exactly a lie, but something made him leave out the details about Rachel. These late nights became more frequent. Sometimes they weren't even really working, just talking about life, dreams, their different perspectives on the world. Rachel told him about backpacking through Europe after college, about her plans to eventually start her own company. Her stories made his own life seem suddenly small and confined. You've built something amazing here, she told him one evening, perched on the edge of his desk. But don't you ever wonder what else you could do? What other mountains you could climb? The question hit uncomfortably close to home. David found himself opening up about his own forgotten dreams, the ambitions he packed away in favor of stability and responsibility. Rachel listened with genuine interest, never judging, just understanding. At home, the contrast became increasingly stark. Linda's conversations revolved around household management and social obligations. The kids were absorbed in their own teenage worlds. David started finding excuses to work late, to attend industry events where he knew Rachel would be present. He told himself it was innocent, just a meeting of minds, a professional mentorship. But he couldn't ignore the way his heart raced when Rachel walked into a room, or how he found himself dressing more carefully on days he knew he'd see her. The first real line was crossed at a business conference in Chicago. They'd had a successful presentation, and the whole team went out to celebrate. As the evening wore on, people gradually drifted away until only David and Rachel remained at the hotel bar. "You were brilliant today," Rachel said, her eyes bright with excitement and maybe a little too much wine. "The way you handled those investor questions. I love watching you when you're in your element like that." The word love hung in the air between them. David knew he should leave, should say goodnight and go up to his room. Instead, he found himself suggesting one more drink. They ended up walking through the city at midnight, Rachel showing him hidden architectural gems she'd discovered during her college years here. Standing on a bridge overlooking the river, city lights reflecting off the water, she turned to him with an intensity that made his breath catch. "Life's too short to live it halfway," she said softly. "Sometimes you have to be brave enough to reach for what you really want." David felt dizzy, and not from the drinks. Everything he'd been feeling, everything he'd been trying to deny, crystallized in that moment. He took a step closer to Rachel, close enough to smell her perfume, but a text message alert broke the spell. Grace asking when he'd be home from his business trip. The guilt hit him like a physical blow. He stepped back, made some excuse about being tired, and practically fled to his hotel room. Back home, things felt different. Every conversation with Linda felt forced, every family dinner an exercise in going through the motions. David caught himself comparing his wife's practical concerns about the household budget to Rachel's passionate discussions about market trends and innovation. He started noticing all the little ways his marriage had become stale. Linda's reading glasses left on every surface drove him crazy. Her tendency to plan every weekend weeks in advance felt suffocating. Even the way she always ordered the same thing at restaurants suddenly seemed symbolic of everything wrong in his life. Rachel, meanwhile, represented everything exciting and new. She introduced him to fusion restaurants he'd never tried, sent him articles about emerging business trends, challenged his thinking in ways that make him feel alive. Their text conversations became more frequent, more personal. The situation came to a head during a company celebration for landing a major contract. Rachel had played a crucial role in securing the deal, and her marketing presentation had blown the clients away. In the excitement of the moment, she hugged David, a brief, professional embrace that nonetheless sent electricity through his body. Later that night, lying awake beside Linda, David couldn't stop thinking about that hug, about the way Rachel's eyes had shone with triumph, about how alive he felt in her presence. His wife's quiet breathing beside him felt like an accusation. The next day, Rachel stopped by his office to discuss the project timeline. As she leaned over his desk to point something out on the schedule, their hands brushed. Neither pulled away immediately. "David," she said quietly, looking at him with those intense eyes, "I think we need to talk about what's happening here." He knew he should shut this down, should establish clear professional boundaries. Instead, he heard himself saying, "Maybe we should discuss this over dinner." That dinner turned into several dinners. They told themselves they were just colleagues having working meals, but the conversations had nothing to do with work. David found himself sharing things he'd never told anyone, not even Linda. Rachel understood him in a way that felt almost magical. The guilt was constant, but so was the exhilarating sense of possibility that Rachel brought to his life. He started imagining a different future, one where he wasn't just going through the motions, where every day held the potential for something new and exciting. What he didn't realize was that he was standing on the edge of a precipice, about to make a decision that would forever alter not just his life, but the lives of everyone he loved. The comfortable numbness he'd been trying to escape was about to give way to something far more complicated and painful than he could have imagined. The day David decided to leave his family started like any other. He got up early, went through his morning routine, and kissed Linda goodbye. But inside, he was already gone. The weight of his decision sat heavy in his chest as he drove to work, knowing that by evening, everything would change. He'd spent weeks planning this moment. The apartment lease was signed, hidden bank accounts set up, legal paperwork prepared. Rachel had been patient, never pushing him, but the unspoken promise of their future together hung between them every time they met. Throughout the day, David kept checking his phone, looking at the family photo on his desk. Grace had her braces in that picture. Michael was still shorter than Linda, and they were all smiling on their vacation in Hawaii last year. Had he been unhappy even then? He couldn't remember anymore. At 5 o'clock, instead of driving home, he drove to the apartment he'd rented across town. The furniture he'd secretly ordered was being delivered, a fresh start, that's what Rachel called it. He changed his clothes there, trying not to think about Linda preparing dinner, waiting for him to come home. The drive back to his house felt surreal. The familiar streets seemed to belong to another life, one he was about to walk away from. He'd rehearsed what he would say countless times, but as he parked in the driveway, all his carefully prepared words evaporated. Linda was in the kitchen when he walked in. "You're late," she said, not looking up from the vegetables she was chopping. "Michael has a game tonight, remember?" "Linda," he said, his voice strange in his own ears. "We need to talk." She must have heard something in his tone, because she put down the knife and turned to face him. "What's wrong?" "Maybe we should sit down," he suggested, heading toward the living room. The same room where they'd celebrated birthdays, Christmas mornings, family movie nights. The room where he was about to destroy 20 years of marriage. "I'm leaving," he said finally, the words falling like stones into the silence. "I've been seeing someone. I've rented an apartment. I think it's best if I move out tonight." Linda didn't scream or cry like he expected. She just sat there, very still, her face draining of color. "How long?" she asked quietly. "A few months," he admitted, though the emotional affair had started long before the physical one. "She's someone from work." "Rachel," Linda said, and David's surprise must have shown on his face. "I'm not stupid, David. I've seen how you light up when you talk about her. I just didn't want to believe it." The front door slammed, Michael coming home from practice. David watched his son's face change as he took in the scene, both parents sitting stiffly in the living room, Linda's pale face, the heavy atmosphere. "What's going on?" Michael asked, his gym bag dropping to the floor. Before David could answer, Grace came down the stairs, probably drawn by the unusual quiet. She took one look at her mother's face and knew. Teenagers had a radar for these things. "Dad's leaving us," Linda said, and a voice steady but hollow. "He's in love with someone else." The next hour was a blur of accusations, tears, and slammed doors. Michael stormed out of the house, ignoring David's calls to come back. Grace locked herself in her room, her sobs audible through the door. Linda moved through the house like a ghost, helping David pack his things with mechanical efficiency. "I never meant to hurt any of you," David said, standing in the doorway with his suitcases. The words sounded pathetic even to him. "But you did," Linda replied simply. "You chose to." Driving to his new apartment, David felt numb. He'd expected to feel relieved, maybe even excited about starting his new life. Instead, he felt like he'd amputated part of himself. Rachel called while he was unpacking, but he let it go to voicemail. He needed to be alone with what he'd done. The next few weeks were a crash course in the reality of destroying a family. Michael refused to speak to him. Grace would only communicate through text messages, one-word responses to his attempts at conversation. Linda's lawyer contacted him about divorce proceedings. At work, things became complicated. Despite their discretion, word got out about his relationship with Rachel. He saw the disapproving looks, heard the whispered conversations that stopped when he entered a room. Several long-term clients suddenly became hard to reach. Rachel was supportive, helping him furnish his apartment, trying to make it feel like home. But there was a neediness to her attention now, as if she was trying to prove that their love was worth all this destruction. Sometimes, late at night, David caught her watching him with a worried expression, perhaps wondering if she'd someday be replaced by someone younger too. The first holiday after leaving was the hardest. He'd thought he and the kids could have Thanksgiving dinner at his apartment, a way to start building new traditions. But Michael flatly refused to come, and Grace made excuses at the last minute. He and Rachel ended up ordering Chinese food and watching movies, both pretending this was exactly what they wanted. His friends gradually took sides. Couples they'd known for years stopped inviting him to gatherings. He understood. He was the villain in their story, the cautionary tale they whispered about over dinner. Only his college buddy Tom still met him for occasional drinks, and even he couldn't hide his disappointment. Was it worth it? Tom asked one night after several beers. throwing away 20 years for a girl young enough to be your daughter. David wanted to explain about the emptiness he'd felt, the dying of dreams, the intoxicating promise of a fresh start. But looking at his old friend's face, he knew no explanation would be enough. The worst part was running into Linda at Michael's basketball game. She looked different, thinner, but somehow stronger. She'd cut her hair, started dressing differently. When their eyes met across the gym, she gave him a small, composed nod and turned away. Her dignity made him feel small and shabby in comparison. That night, lying in his modern apartment with Rachel sleeping beside him, David stared at the unfamiliar ceiling and wondered about the true cost of happiness. He'd thought unhappiness was living a life of quiet desperation, going through the motions day after day. Now he wondered if real unhappiness was watching your children's hearts break and knowing you were the cause. But there was no going back. He'd made his choice, burned his bridges, and now he had to live with the consequences. The future he'd imagined with Rachel stretched ahead of him, exciting, uncertain, and haunted by the ghosts of what he'd destroyed to get there. What he didn't know was that fate had its own plans, and the story was far from over. The price of his choices would continue to unfold in ways he never could have anticipated. 6 months into his new life with Rachel, David woke up to the smell of fresh coffee and unfamiliar music playing from the kitchen. Their downtown apartment was flooded with morning light, reflecting off the sleek, modern furniture they'd chosen together. Everything was new, clean, untouched by memories. Rachel was dancing around the kitchen in her workout clothes, making smoothie bowls, something Linda would never have done. She beamed when she saw him. "Good morning. I signed us up for that new fusion cooking class tonight. It'll be fun." David forced a smile. The constant stream of activities had become Rachel's way of building their life together. Art galleries, wine tastings, trendy restaurants, everything designed to prove they were more than just an affair, that they were building something real. "Actually, tonight's Michael's championship game," David said, pouring his coffee. "I thought I might go." Rachel's smile dimmed slightly. "Oh, will he? Does he know you're coming?" David hadn't told Michael. His son still wasn't answering his calls, communicating only through Linda when absolutely necessary. "I thought I'd just show up. Support from the sidelines." "I could come with you," Rachel offered, though they both knew that wouldn't happen. His children had made it clear they wanted nothing to do with the woman who'd broken up their family. At work, things had settled into an uncomfortable new normal. Rachel had been moved to a different department to avoid direct reporting issues, but rumors still circulated. Some younger employees seemed to admire their courage in choosing love over convention. The older ones, especially those with families, treated David with a coldness that went beyond professional distance. That evening, David sat in the back row of the school gymnasium watching Michael warm up. His son had grown taller in the months since he'd left, or maybe he just hadn't noticed before. The thought stung. Linda was there with Grace, sitting with their old neighbors. She'd started doing yoga, lost some weight, and there was a new confidence in her posture. Some of the other parents greeted her warmly, pointedly ignoring David's presence. The game was intense. Michael played better than David had ever seen, scoring the winning basket in the final seconds. The crowd erupted, parents rushing onto the court to congratulate their kids. David watched from his seat as Linda hugged Michael, as Grace jumped up and down with excitement. His family's joy felt like something viewed through thick glass, visible but untouchable. He left without trying to speak to them. Back at the apartment, Rachel was waiting with takeout from an expensive Thai restaurant. "How was the game?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "He won," David said, not elaborating. How could he explain the pain of watching his family celebrate without him? Rachel was only 28. She couldn't understand what it meant to become a stranger to your own children. Their life together had its good moments. Rachel's enthusiasm for everything was contagious, and sometimes David felt decades younger. They traveled to places he'd never considered visiting, tried experiences he'd always been too conservative to attempt. The physical attraction between them was still strong. But there were other moments, increasingly frequent, when the age gap became impossible to ignore. Rachel's friends, all in their late 20s, made him feel ancient when they came over. Their references, their music, their endless energy for late-night socializing, it was exhausting trying to keep up. Money was another issue. The divorce had been expensive, and David was paying hefty alimony plus helping with the kids' college funds. Rachel's taste for luxury didn't help. She'd grown up wealthy and saw nothing wrong with spending hundreds on dinner or thousands on vacation packages. "We should go to Bali next month," she suggested one evening, scrolling through Instagram. "My friend Zoe posted the most amazing pictures from this boutique resort." David thought about his dwindling savings, the credit card bills piling up. "Maybe we should stay local for a while," he said carefully. "The divorce settlement is hitting pretty hard." Rachel looked up, frowning. "But you said the business was doing well." "It is, but," he trailed off, not wanting to explain that some major clients had quietly taken their business elsewhere after the scandal of his affair became public knowledge. Their first serious fight happened over Grace's graduation. David had assumed Rachel would understand that he needed to attend alone. Instead, she'd burst into tears. "I'm tired of being your dirty secret," she'd shouted. "When will I get to be part of your real life?" "They're not ready," he tried to explain. "They may never be ready." "And what about me? How long do I have to wait?" "I gave up everything to be with you." The words hung in the air between them. What exactly had she given up? Her reputation at work, maybe. Some disapproving looks from friends. But she hadn't lost her family, her history, her sense of belonging somewhere. That night, lying awake beside Rachel's sleeping form, David scrolled through old family photos on his phone. Birthday parties, school plays, family vacations, a lifetime of memories he could never get back. Linda had sent him an email about Michael's college applications, formal and businesslike. Their son wanted to study on the opposite coast, as far from home as possible. The next morning, Rachel was extra affectionate, trying to make up for their fight. She made plans for a weekend getaway, talked about their future together. But something had shifted, like a tiny crack in a foundation that would only grow larger with time. At work, David noticed Rachel chatting with the new IT consultant, someone closer to her age. He told himself he was being paranoid, that she'd chosen him, left her own promising career track to be with him. But late at night, his insecurities whispered, wasn't this how it had started with Linda? Their age gap showed up in unexpected ways. When David talked about his favorite movies, Rachel looked blank. When she got excited about new technology or social media trends, he felt hopelessly out of touch. Even their political views often clashed, shaped by different generations and experiences. More and more often, David found himself driving past his old house, slowing down to look at the familiar windows. Linda's car was usually in the driveway, sometimes accompanied by an unfamiliar SUV that made his stomach clench. The basketball hoop still hung over the garage, though Michael rarely played there anymore. One evening, sitting alone at a bar while Rachel was at a work event, David struck up a conversation with the bartender. "I left my wife for a younger woman," he found himself saying after a few drinks. "Thought it would make me happy." The bartender, a man about his age, just nodded. "And did it?" David stared into his glass, not answering. The question echoed in his mind as he headed home to the sleek apartment with its modern furniture and city views. Rachel would be waiting, beautiful and young, and increasingly uncertain in her role as the other woman-turned-partner. What he didn't know then was that fate was about to throw him another curveball, one that would make him question everything he thought he knew about happiness, love, and the price of starting over. The first sign that something was changing came during a regular Tuesday morning meeting. David noticed Rachel laughing a bit too hard at the new IT consultant's jokes. They were discussing the company's digital transformation project, but her eyes kept drifting to Ryan's face, much like they used to drift toward David's not so long ago. Later that week, David found himself at Michael's college send-off party. Linda had reluctantly invited him, making it clear that Rachel wasn't welcome. The house looked different. Linda had redecorated, replaced their old furniture with pieces that better suited her taste. The familiar family photos were gone from the walls. "Dad, you made it," Michael said when he arrived, his tone carefully neutral. It was the most words his son had spoken to him in months. Grace gave him a quick, awkward hug before disappearing upstairs with her friends. Watching Linda move confidently through the crowd of guests, David felt like a ghost in his own past. She'd started her own interior design business, he learned from listening to conversations. Their old friends treated her with warm admiration. the wronged wife who'd rebuilt her life with grace and dignity. "The house looks great," he tried to tell her during a quiet moment. "Thanks," she replied, then added with a small smile, "It's amazing how freeing it is to finally choose things for myself." The words hit harder than she probably intended. Back at his apartment that night, David looked around at the modern decor Rachel had chosen. Had he really picked any of it, or had he just gone along with her vision of their life together, just as he'd once gone along with Linda's? The cracks in his relationship with Rachel were becoming harder to ignore. She was spending more time at work, often mentioning how brilliant Ryan's ideas were for modernizing their systems. David recognized the signs, the lingering glances, the inside jokes, the subtle pulling away. He'd done the same thing to Linda. Money was becoming a serious issue. The business was struggling. Several more major clients had quietly taken their projects elsewhere. The expensive restaurants and weekend getaways Rachel loved were draining his already strained resources. When he suggested cutting back, she looked at him like he was becoming someone she hadn't signed up for. "Maybe I should look for my own place," she said one evening, after another tense discussion about finances, "just to have some space to think." David knew what that meant. He used similar words with Linda. The irony wasn't lost on him. At work, he started noticing Rachel and Ryan having coffee together in the break room, their heads close together as they looked at something on Ryan's phone. They quickly separated whenever David walked in, but the guilty looks told him everything he needed to know. One night, Rachel didn't come home until late. Her excuse about a work emergency might have been believable if David hadn't seen her car parked outside a downtown restaurant earlier that evening. Through the window, he glimpsed her and Ryan sharing what was clearly not a business dinner. "I think we need to talk," he said when she finally came in, her cheeks flushed from wine and secrets. Rachel sat down heavily on their expensive sofa. "Yes," she agreed, "we do." The conversation that followed was painfully familiar, though this time David was on the other side. Rachel talked about growing apart, about wanting different things, about needing to find herself. All the same cliches he used with Linda now turned back on him like a mirror showing him his worst self. "I never meant for this to happen," Rachel said, echoing his own words from a year ago. "Ryan and I, we just connected." David wanted to be angry, to feel betrayed, but all he could feel was a deep, exhausting sadness. Wasn't this exactly what he deserved? The next few weeks passed in a blur. Rachel moved out, taking most of the furniture they'd bought together. The apartment felt empty, but David couldn't bring himself to care about filling it. He worked late hours, avoided the break room where he might see Rachel and Ryan together, and tried not to think about how quickly life could come full circle. One Saturday, he ran into Linda at the grocery store. She was with someone, a distinguished-looking man about their age who looked at her with obvious admiration. She introduced him as James, an architect she'd met through her interior design work. "We're renovating the kitchen," Linda said, her hand casually resting on James's arm. The old one was overdue for an update. David remembered all the times she'd talked about wanting to remodel that kitchen. He'd always said it was too expensive, too much hassle. Now, watching her discuss renovation plans with James, he realized how much he'd taken her dreams for granted. That night, sitting alone in his half-empty apartment, David opened his laptop and found himself looking at old family photos. There was one from their 20th anniversary dinner, just months before he met Rachel. Linda was smiling at him across the table, love still visible in her eyes despite the routine their life had become. He thought about all the things he'd thrown away in pursuit of excitement and novelty. The comfortable silence of Sunday mornings with Linda. The way she knew exactly how he liked his coffee. The shared language of inside jokes built over decades. The deep understanding that came from growing up together, facing life's challenges side by side. Now Linda was building a new life without him, their children were moving forward with their own lives, and Rachel had simply followed the same path he had, trading the familiar for the exciting, the old for the new. A text message lit up his phone. Grace asking if he helped with her college applications. It was a small olive branch, but it meant everything. He replied immediately, suggesting they meet for coffee that weekend. Looking out at the city lights, David thought about choices and consequences, about the true meaning of happiness, and about the wisdom that comes too late. He had wanted more from life, But in chasing what he thought was missing, he'd lost sight of everything he already had. What he didn't realize was that fate wasn't finished with him yet. The real test of his character and his chance for redemption was still to come. The irony hit David hardest on a rainy Tuesday evening. He was sitting in his car outside the restaurant where he used to meet Rachel, watching her laugh with Ryan through the window. She was wearing the dress he bought her for her birthday, her hand casually resting on Ryan's arm, exactly the way she used to touch David. "Well, this feels familiar," he muttered to himself, remembering all the times he'd met Rachel here while Linda was at home waiting. The universe, it seemed, had a twisted sense of humor. His phone buzzed. A message from Grace asking if they were still on for coffee tomorrow to discuss her college applications. These meetings had become their new ritual, a careful rebuilding of their relationship. She was even beginning to smile at him again, though her eyes still held a hint of wariness. The company was struggling now. Word had gotten around about Rachel and Ryan's relationship, creating another scandal. More clients were pulling out, and the board was getting nervous. David spent his days in damage control, trying to hold together the business he'd spent decades building. "Maybe it's time to consider selling," his financial advisor suggested during their monthly meeting. "The company's value is dropping, and with the divorce settlement and your recent lifestyle changes." David cut him off. He couldn't bear to hear the details of his financial freefall. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd sacrificed his family's stability for a relationship that had crumbled in less than 2 years. That weekend, Michael came home from college for a brief visit. David met him for lunch. Another careful step in their healing process. His son looked older, more mature, his eyes holding a wisdom that shouldn't belong to someone so young. "I saw Rachel with that 8 guy at the mall," Michael said, studying his father's reaction. "Mom says what goes around comes around." "Your mother's a wise woman," David replied, trying to smile. "I just wish I'd realized that sooner." "You know what's weird?" Michael continued, pushing his food around his plate. "I was so angry at you for so long, but seeing Rachel do the same thing to you. I don't know. Maybe people just make mistakes." The forgiveness in his son's words brought unexpected tears to David's eyes. He blinked them away quickly, but not before Michael noticed. Later that week, David had to attend a company gala, one of those formal events he'd always hated. Rachel was there with Ryan, both of them trying to be discreet but failing miserably. The whispers and sideways glances from colleagues felt eerily familiar. During the dinner, he overheard a conversation at the next table. "Poor David," someone said. "First he leaves his wife for Rachel, now Rachel leaves him for Ryan. Karma's quite the teacher, isn't it?" He excused himself and headed to the balcony for some air. Standing there in the cool night breeze, he thought about all the choices that had led to this moment. The slow erosion of his marriage to Linda, the intoxicating beginnings with Rachel, the painful endings that seemed to echo each other. His phone lit up with a text from Linda. "Grace showed me her college essay. You did a good job helping her with it." It was a small thing, this acknowledgement, but it meant something. They were learning to be parents together again, even if they couldn't be partners. The next morning, David arrived at work to find Rachel clearing out her desk. She'd accepted a position at another company, with Ryan, of course. Standing there, watching her pack her things, David felt an odd sense of déjà vu. "I really am sorry," she said, not quite meeting his eyes. "I never meant to hurt me," David finished for her. "Yeah, I said the same thing to Linda." Rachel flinched at the comparison. "It's different," she protested weakly. "Is it?" David asked quietly. "Or are we just telling ourselves that to feel better about our choices?" That evening, driving home to his empty apartment, David passed his old house. Linda's car was in the driveway, along with James's SUV. Through the window, he could see them in the kitchen. The one she'd finally renovated, cooking dinner together. They moved around each other with an easy familiarity that made his chest ache. He thought about calling Rachel, maybe trying to work things out. But what would be the point? They'd both just be prolonging an ending that had been written from the beginning. Young women who left their jobs for older, married men eventually became older women who got left for younger ones. It was a cycle as old as time. At home, David sat in his half-empty apartment, surrounded by the modern furniture Rachel had chosen, furniture that now felt as hollow and meaningless as their relationship had become. On his coffee table lay Grace's college applications, waiting for his review. At least this was something real, something he could still do right. His phone buzzed again, another text from Linda. "James and I are having a small dinner party next weekend. Michael and Grace will be there. You're welcome to join us if you'd like." David stared at the message for a long time. The invitation wasn't offered out of love or forgiveness, but out of something perhaps more valuable: understanding. Linda had moved forward with her life, found happiness again, and now she was strong enough to offer him a place in their children's lives without bitterness. Looking out at the city lights, David thought about the strange paths life takes us down. He'd left his family chasing some dream of excitement and renewal, only to find himself exactly where he'd started, but with everything that truly mattered stripped away. Yet here, in the depths of his karma-delivered lesson, he was beginning to understand something profound about love, loyalty, and the true meaning of happiness. The question was, what would he do with this hard-won wisdom? The answer to that question would come sooner than he expected, bringing with it one final twist in his journey toward redemption. Time has a way of teaching us the lessons we most need to learn. For David, that lesson came full circle during Linda's dinner party. He'd accepted her invitation, arriving with a bottle of wine and a heart full of uncertainty. The house, his former home, had transformed completely. Linda's renovations reflected her newfound confidence. The warm yellow walls he'd always resisted painting were now a sophisticated gray. New artwork hung where family photos once dominated. Even the air felt different, filled with the aroma of unfamiliar recipes. James greeted him at the door with unexpected warmth. "Linda's in the kitchen with the kids," he said, leading David through the house. "She's teaching Grace that lasagna recipe of hers." The scene in the kitchen stopped David in his tracks. Linda stood at the counter, showing Grace how to lay the pasta while Michael sat at the island, talking about his college experiences. It was a picture of family harmony, one that no longer included him at its center. "Dad," Grace called out, her smile genuine for the first time in years. "Mom's finally teaching me her secret recipe." Linda looked up, flour on her cheek, and nodded in greeting. "There's wine in the living room," she said easily. "We'll be done here soon." Throughout dinner, David watched the easy interaction between his children and James. The man had slipped into their lives naturally, filling the void David had left with quiet strength and genuine interest in their lives. He asked Michael intelligent questions about his studies and showed real enthusiasm for Grace's college plans. "James is helping me apply for architecture programs," Grace mentioned. "He thinks I have a real eye for design." David felt a pang, remembering how he dismissed Grace's interest in architecture as impractical. Now here was James, nurturing the very dreams he overlooked. After dinner, while Linda and the kids cleared the table, James took David aside. "I know this isn't easy," he said quietly, "but you should be proud. You've raised remarkable children." "I think Linda did most of that," David replied honestly. "Especially these past few years." "The past is the past," James said. "What matters is where we go from here." Those words stayed with David long after he'd left the dinner party. Driving through the city, he passed the restaurant where he'd first met Rachel. Through the window, he caught a glimpse of her and Ryan, looking very much like he and Rachel had once looked, lost in their own world, believing their love was different, special, immune to time's tests. The next morning, David made a decision. He called an emergency board meeting at his company. "I've been holding on to control too tightly," he told them. "It's time for fresh perspectives." Over the next few months, David began stepping back from day-to-day operations, mentoring younger executives to take over. He focused instead on rebuilding relationships with long-term clients, many of whom appreciated his honest acknowledgement of past mistakes. He sold his downtown apartment, buying a smaller place closer to where Grace would be attending college. The furniture Rachel had chosen went to charity. His new home he furnished simply, with pieces that reflected his own tastes rather than someone else's idea of who he should be. Linda called one day to tell him she and James were getting married. "The kids wanted you to hear it from me," she said. "They'd like you to be there." "I'd be honored," David replied, and meant it. "James is a good man." "Yes," Linda agreed softly. "He is." The unspoken comparison hung between them, but without bitterness. At the wedding, David watched his former wife dance with her new husband. Linda was radiant, more confident and happy than he'd seen her in years. James held her like she was precious, his eyes never straying to younger women in the crowd. Michael joined David at his table. "You okay, Dad?" "I am," David said, realizing it was true. "Your mom deserves this happiness." "So do you," Michael said after a pause. "But maybe happiness isn't what we think it is when we're chasing it." Out of the mouths of babes, David thought, smiling at his son's wisdom. Later that year, David heard that Rachel and Ryan had broken up. She'd caught him with a new intern, a predictable end to a predictable story. She tried calling David once, perhaps seeking comfort in the familiar, but he let it go to voicemail. Some chapters were better left closed. Instead, David focused on building a new kind of life. He started mentoring young entrepreneurs, finding satisfaction in helping others avoid the pitfalls he'd encountered. He attended every one of Grace's architecture presentations, beaming with genuine pride at her growing talent. He and Michael started a tradition of monthly hiking trips, rebuilding their bond one conversation at a time. Linda and James included him in family gatherings, creating a new normal that, while different from what he'd once had, held its own kind of peace. The children thrived in this environment of mutual respect and shared care. One evening, sitting on his balcony watching the sunset, David thought about the journey that had brought him here. He'd lost the comfortable life he'd taken for granted, thrown away a marriage built on decades of shared history, all for the illusion of recaptured youth. But in losing everything, he'd gained something unexpected: wisdom, humility, and a deeper understanding of what really matters in life. He picked up his phone and texted his children, "Proud of you both. Dinner this weekend." Their quick, positive responses brought a smile to his face. It wasn't the life he planned, but maybe it was the life he needed to learn what true happiness meant. Not the fleeting excitement of new romance or the artificial youth sought in younger company, but the deep satisfaction of genuine connections, of being present for the people who matter most. As he watched the last rays of sun paint the sky in brilliant colors, David finally understood that sometimes the biggest adventure isn't in chasing what you don't have, but in rediscovering the value of what was there all along. The end.